reading now from the book of Acts. Listen for the word. When the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place. And suddenly, from heaven, there came a sound like a rush of a violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues as of fire appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them ability. Now there were devout Jews from every nation under heaven living in Jerusalem. And at this sound the crowd gathered and was bewildered because each one heard them speaking in the native language of each. Amazed and astonished, they asked, "Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? How is it that we hear, each of us, in our own native language?" All were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" But others sneered and said, "They are filled with new wine." But Peter, standing with the 11, raised his voice and addressed them, "Men of Judea, and all who live in Jerusalem, let this be known to you and listen to what I say. Indeed, these are not drunk as you suppose, for it is only 9 o'clock in the morning. No, this is what was spoken through the prophet Joel. In the last days it will be, God declares, that I will pour out my Spirit upon all flesh. And your sons and daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. Even upon my slaves, both men and women, in those days I will pour out my Spirit, and they shall prophesy. And I will show portents in the heaven above and signs in the earth below, blood and fire and smoky mist. And the sun shall turn to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the Lord's great and glorious day. Then everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. As our kiddos head out perhaps to be with Hannah, why don't we give them a round of applause for their good work today? Thank you, kiddos. When I was in first grade, a new little girl, oh, poor Joe. Oh, thank you, Hannah, and have a good time. When I was in the first grade, a new little girl joined our class mid-year. Her family was from Mexico, and she hardly spoke any English. And I remember how nervous she looked. I was amazed by her because I could imagine how terrified I would have been in her shoes. When I got home, I told my mom about this new girl and how she couldn't speak any English. And my mom, always like a sage to me, said, "Well, how about I teach you some Spanish phrases so that you can try to talk to her?" The possibility hadn't even occurred to me that I could try to speak her language. Theologians draw a connection between our Old Testament story of the Tower of Babel that Warren read this morning and the New Testament story of Pentecost. They point out that Pentecost is a divine reversal of Babel. The Babel story represents the ancient Israelites grappling with how this world God made came to be so divided and fractured. And the story's wisdom roots our division in our pride and selfishness. The story is about people who want to be gods, trying to build a tower all the way to the heavens, and the result is chaos and confusion and division. At Pentecost, it's all reversed. Rather than humans trying to build to the heavens, the Spirit descends to us. Rather than humans seeking to become gods, our hearts are instead opened to receive the gracious gift of God's presence with us. And rather than sending people into confusion and division, the Spirit brings all people into communion as God's love and power transcend every barrier of difference. And rather than people devoting their lives to a self-serving mission like a tower to the heavens, at Pentecost, we are given a new sacrificial mission of grace to go and be the church for all the world. Pentecost reminds us that as Christians, we are all called to be missionaries. To be the church is to allow the Spirit to lead us into new relationships with unknown places and people so that we may both bring and discover God's grace in every corner of the earth. When I was in seminary, the school was having trouble finding a professor to teach the mission and evangelism course. When they finally found someone to teach it just for a semester, I signed up to take it and got some insight into why that hiring might have been a challenge. See, among the very progressive student body, the terms mission and evangelism had come to be defined by their worst, most destructive versions. On the first day of class, our professor asked us, "What do you think of when you think of the Christian missionaries?" And I could tell from his demeanor, he was expecting to hear stories of our heroes. Instead, this is what he heard: colonialism, imperialism, the spread of diseases to native cultures. My heart went out to the professor because I was a little caught off guard too. I thought there might be a more balanced response. My grandparents were medical missionaries in the Congo, and they are my heroes. Yet two things can be true at once. There are destructive iterations of mission and evangelism, and there are beautiful ones as well. And one of the central differences between the two, the helpful and the harmful, can be described by one of my grandfather's core convictions about mission work. He was a surgeon who traveled the world, and it was his deepest conviction that you have to learn how to speak other people's languages. Now, on one level, he meant this literally. He was gifted in languages and learned to speak many of them, but thankfully for people like me, he also meant it theologically. You've got to learn to speak someone else's language means you need to strive to understand them, to understand what moves them and motivates them, gives them hope, fills them with fear. Perhaps above all, if you want to show love to another person, you must seek to understand what it is they love. A major difference between the missions that hurt and those that helped, the ones that cultivated dependency and the ones that empowered, those that harmed and those that healed, was this attitude. The missionaries' own sense that they needed to speak the language of the other, that they needed to learn the people, to seek to love what the people they served loved. Today, Richard Lischer is an author, theologian, and professor emeritus at Duke, but in the early 1970s, he was taking on his first call to pastor a small church in a rural parish in Illinois. In his memoir, he describes that it was an awkward fit. He felt a striking sense of disappointment when he pulled up to the church for the first time out in the middle of nowhere and saw both the church and the parsonage in disrepair. The cross on the top of the steeple, he writes, had one arm. On the other hand, his congregation also felt a sinking sense of disappointment that they had been sent a young intellectual, A hotshot, they figured, who thought he was too good for them. They knew he couldn't understand their lives. And Lisher admits at first he didn't. Now, the story of Lisher and his congregation growing in grace is the story of Lisher learning to speak their language. At first, he was terrible at it. He calls his first sermons to that church ludicrous. He talks about how he quoted obscure philosophers. Personally, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And tackled heavy intellectual issues that, in retrospect, he realized meant very little to his congregation of farmers. He says, "My audience paid a heavy price for the gospel in my sermons. They had to swallow my existentialism and psychology before I served them anything remotely recognizable. I required them to view the world and its problems through my eyes. I asked that they pretend to be me." Lisher powerfully asks in his memoir, "Why couldn't I see the revelation of God in our little church? In our community, everyone pitched in and learned to care for a little girl with cerebral palsy. We helped one another put up hay before the rains came. We all grieved when a neighbor lost his farm, and we refused to buy his tools at the auction. As people, we walked into the fields every April and blessed the seeds before planting them. But whatever lay closest to the soul of the congregation," he says, "I unfailingly omitted from my sermons. I didn't despise these practices. I simply didn't see them." But he learned to see them. And I want to share one of his most poignant stories this morning because it's a striking one for us today on this Sunday before Memorial Day. When Lisher arrived at his church, he was disappointed to see the American flag in the sanctuary. He felt it had no place there, so he gathered the church for a town hall and explained that while he had nothing against patriotism, that it was a dangerous, slippery slope from God and country to God equals country. He made his point, but then a farmer in the congregation got up to speak. And with the simplicity and vagueness characteristic of his family, the farmer told this story. "We had an uncle named Warren who went like he was supposed to and wound up at a place called Anzio. I was a kid when he left, seemed like he was gone forever, which in a way of speaking, he was. I won't ever forget when the telegram came, because it came to our house first, and we went with the man to Aunt Mary's. Some of you remember that day. I know I'll never forget." Then the farmer sat down. Lisher said, despite all the parts of the story not said out loud, everyone understood. It turned out for this congregation, the flag did not represent civil religion or any other abstraction. It simply told a story that everyone wanted to remember, but found too sorrowful to repeat. Lisher said, the flag stayed. The power in that story isn't that the congregation was right and the pastor wrong, but neither was the pastor right and the congregation wrong. The power was in the farmer's gracious decision to share his story and the pastor's gracious decision to be a missionary. That is, to pause and put aside his own agenda and certainty in order to speak the language of his congregation. This kind of move paves the way for real transformation. Somewhere down the road, if this pastor wanted to discuss the flag again, I think he'd do it differently. Rather than call a town hall and say, look, people, this is what this means and this is what we need to do, I could imagine him asking questions. The tension would still be there. The dialogue still necessary. But they could speak each other's language. The world today is desperate for these kind of missionaries. We are far too comfortable judging and writing each other off from afar, never learning to speak each other's languages. One piece of advice passed down to pastors taking calls at new churches is this: for one whole year, try not to change anything. The wisdom behind it is, before you start doing anything, know your people. But I wonder if we should all be implementing this wisdom. When you encounter a person you do not understand, and especially if you find them easy to judge, build a relationship with them. And maybe for one whole year, don't try to challenge them or change them. Learn them. Learn their language. It's the first step love takes. I want to close with just one more thought. On Pentecost, Peter quoted the prophet Joel when he said, God will say, in the last days, I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh. And this quote reminds us that at Pentecost, the gift of the Spirit was given to the church, but not exclusively to the church. The Spirit is poured out on all flesh. The gift of the Spirit to the church must not be understood as the church possessing and controlling the Spirit. If the church does have a special mission to make disciples of all nations, then Pentecost reminds us that this task is not accomplished by thinking we possess the Spirit and the truth and must go and share it with people who don't have it. No, the task of sharing the good news is better accomplished when we go out into the world knowing the Spirit always goes before us. Where we can go, the Spirit is already there. Our job is to see the sparks of the Spirit's presence, especially in hurting places, and to help breathe those sparks into flame. To do that effectively, we've got to learn to speak the languages of others. And we need to learn to see and love the goodness that they love. The world today is desperate for such missionaries. We need urban people learning the language of rural communities and vice versa. We need people learning each other's languages across party lines. We need Christians working with and alongside people of all faith traditions. We need missionaries for racial and socioeconomic justice who really know the people they're trying to help. And the world needs Christians everywhere to remember that we are better able to live into our calling to be the Church of Jesus Christ when we gain that ability to pause our personal agendas and certainties to learn to speak to one another. So by the power of the Spirit and the love that we are blessed to share, may God help all of us grow in our ability to do just that. Amen.